Welcome to our channel. Today, we step into a world where safety was a luxury and every night could be your last. A world where brave families crossed into the unknown, chasing land, freedom, and a future only to face dangers beyond imagination. So join us as we drift back in time to the raw, unpredictable frontier, where cabins stood like lonely beacons in endless wilderness, where fear lived in the silence, and where survival meant defying the darkness itself. This is what it was truly like to survive the most terrifying attacks on the frontier. The frontier was not merely a line on a map. It was a living, breathing boundary between order and chaos, between the known world and the vast wilderness that stretched endlessly beyond. To most people living safely behind stone walls and bustling marketplaces, the frontier was a distant idea, something spoken of in taverns, written in letters, or whispered about in stories. But to the settlers who dared to cross into it, the frontier was reality. It was the ground they stood upon, the air they breathed, and the danger they faced every single day. Life on this edge of civilization demanded courage greater than most would ever understand. The men and women who left behind comfortable villages, crowded cities, or aging homelands did not come because it was easy. They came because the promise of land, freedom, and opportunity called to them louder than the fear of the unknown. Some were driven by hope, others by desperation. A few were dreamers seeking a life untouched by kings, taxes, or rules. Many were simply trying to survive a world that offered them little. But whatever brought them to the frontier, the wilderness had only one lesson: nothing here was guaranteed. Every step away from the old world was a step into uncertainty. Roads became trails, trails became paths, and eventually, paths disappeared entirely into forests older than empires. Trees stood like ancient giants, their limbs twisting high into the sky, blocking the sun and swallowing the ground in darkness. The air carried smells unfamiliar to city noses, the wild scent of pine, damp earth, river mist, and animals watching from the shadows. At night, the forest spoke in whispers, the cry of wolves, the hooting of owls, the rustle of unseen things moving between roots. To a seasoned frontiersman, these sounds were normal. To newcomers, they were reminders that this land belonged to nature, not humans. Still, the settlers pushed onward, with wagons groaning under the weight of tools, food, seeds, blankets, and their most precious possessions. They carved their way across landscapes untouched by plows or wheels. They built makeshift camps under the open sky, their fires flickering against the blackness of the night. They prayed the weather would hold, that the animals would stay away, and that their children would not fall sick on the cold ground. There were no doctors, no medicine, no neighbors to call upon for help. If someone was hurt, they healed or they died. The frontier offered no middle ground. When they finally found a stretch of land that seemed fertile near a river, a patch of meadow, or beneath a ridge that would shield them from storms, they stopped, and in that moment the wilderness became home. The first task was always shelter, not comfort, not decoration, not beauty, just walls to keep the wind out, a roof to stop the rain, a fire to chase the cold. A cabin began as a few logs stacked in a square, then grew into something stronger with each swing of an axe. Children gathered stones for the hearth. Women cooked meals over open flames while watching the tree line, always alert, always listening. Men chopped wood until their bodies ached, knowing that a week's shelter could mean freezing to death in winter. Every cabin on the frontier stood like a challenge, human hands defying the wild, a single structure surrounded by miles of untouched land. In daylight, the settlers worked with purpose. They plowed fields with crude tools, planted seeds, dug wells, fished rivers, and hunted deer. They built barns, smokehouses, and animal pens. Every board of wood, every nail hammered, every tree cut down was an act of survival. But when the sun faded and darkness swallowed the horizon, the voices of the wilderness awakened again, louder, closer. The crack of branches in the distance, the growl of predators hungry and unafraid. The settlers would shutter the doors, gather close inside, and hope the night passed quietly. But night was not always quiet. Because the land they claimed was not empty, long before the settlers arrived, generations of native tribes had lived, hunted, fought, and died on this soil. The rivers were their roads, the forests their sanctuaries, the mountains their ancestors' resting places. To them, the frontier was not wilderness, it was home, and the sudden appearance of strangers, clearing trees and fencing fields, was not simply unsettling, it was a threat. Some tribes tried peace, offering trade and warnings. Others responded with suspicion, a few responded with war, and when conflict erupted, it did so without mercy. News traveled quickly, carried by frightened travelers and tattered letters. Stories spread of raids on lonely cabins, burned farms, missing families, villages that vanished overnight. But stories alone could not stop the tide of settlers still arriving from distant lands. For every family frightened away, 10 more came to take their place. The frontier grew, stretching deeper into territory that resisted being tamed. Those who chose to stay learned caution. They built their homes thicker, higher, stronger. They dug trenches, laid traps, and sharpened stakes around their property. They formed small settlements, combining families into tight communities where many hands could load muskets faster than a single pair. They agreed on signals. 3 shots in the air meant danger. A lantern in a window meant help was needed. They taught their children to be silent when fear crept through the night. They told their wives where to run if the men fell in battle. Yet even with defenses, danger was never far. A frontier farmer could leave home in the morning to plow a field and never return. A child fetching water from the creek could disappear before anyone noticed. A mother hanging laundry outside could hear footsteps in the woods, but when she turned, nothing was there. Fear lived in every heartbeat. Not always loud, not always violent, but constant, like something unseen breathing just over the settlers' shoulders. And still they stayed, because hope was stronger than fear. Hope that the next harvest would be better. Hope that their children would inherit a life free from oppression. Hope that the wilderness could be turned into a new beginning. Hope was the fuel that kept axes swinging, plows moving, wheels turning. It was the invisible force that held families together when everything else seemed determined to tear them apart. But hope did not stop the darkness. It did not silence the howling of wolves, or the thunder of storms, or the warnings passed between tribes preparing for war. On the frontier, peace was fragile, like glass resting on the edge of a table, one breath away from shattering, and when it shattered, the settlers would learn what the wilderness already knew. Survival was not granted. It was earned. As more families arrived, small towns began to form. Clusters of wooden cabins, muddy streets, perhaps a church or a trading post. These settlements became anchors of civilization, but even then, they were surrounded by miles of threat. The nearest fort might be a day's ride away. Soldiers might come only when summoned, and even then, they might arrive too late. The settlers understood that the only defenders they could truly rely on were themselves. So fathers taught their sons to shoot before they could read. Mothers learned to load muskets as quickly as their husbands. Children listened for the sound of horses, arrows, or war cries, the way city children listened for church bells. Before bed, families would check the windows, lock the doors, and push furniture against the entrance. Every night, they wondered if it would be the last they spent in their cabin, and when the wind rustled the trees just the wrong way, they would lie awake, stiff with fear, praying silently. Yet even with danger pressing in from all sides, life did not stop. Babies were born, couples married, crops grew. The sound of laughter echoed in meadows where once only wolves roamed. Human hope rooted itself deeper than fear, growing stronger with every sunrise. But the wilderness had patience. It watched, it waited, because on the frontier, everything could change in a single moment. One shout in the night, one torch in the dark, one crack of a branch too close to the cabin walls. And suddenly, the settlers would discover that survival was not just about building homes and planting crops. It was about enduring the most terrifying attacks the frontier could unleash. And when the day came that fire lit the sky and screams replaced silence, the settlers would learn what it truly meant to stand between civilization and the wild. The attacks on the frontier almost never began with noise. Not with shouting, not with gunfire, not with the chaos we imagine when we think of raids or battles. They began with silence, an unnatural, suffocating silence that wrapped itself around cabins and settlements like a blanket of dread. The settlers who survived long enough came to recognize this silence. They feared it more than thunder, more than storms, more than anything that roared in the night, because storms announced themselves. Wolves howled and rattlesnakes hissed, but an attack whispered. There was something chilling about the way the wilderness grew still before danger. The birds that sang at dusk vanished from the branches. The insects that buzzed through the tall grass went quiet. Even the wind, which always found its way through leaves and cracks in wooden walls, seemed to stop moving. Dogs would lift their heads and stare into the darkness, ears raised, muscles tense. Horses snorted nervously, stamping the ground as if something invisible brushed against them. Cattle herds gathered close together, restless, shifting from hoof to hoof, sensing what humans could not yet see. For the settlers, that silence was the first warning. Mothers would pause while stirring pots over the fire. Fathers' sharpening tools would lift their heads, eyes narrowing toward the thick tree line. Children playing outside would freeze, suddenly unsure why they felt the urge to run inside and hide. Everyone on the frontier understood that nature never grew quiet without a reason. When the land went cold and still, it meant something was coming. Something watching, something waiting. The second warning was darkness, thicker than usual, heavier, pressing against the wooden walls of cabins like a living thing. Flames from lanterns flickered strangely. Shadows danced across the floor. It always felt as if the night itself was leaning closer. Families would gather inside, doors latched, windows shuttered. Fathers reached for muskets. Mothers pulled children to their beds and whispered prayers into their hair. Most times, nothing happened. A long, tense night passed, and morning arrived without incident. But that did not matter, because one night the silence broke, and when it did, it shattered the world. Sometimes it began with a scream, not a word, not a call for help, just a scream, raw and desperate, cutting through the night like a jagged blade. Other times, a musket fired, its thunder echoing across the valley. A single gunshot in the dark meant one thing: someone had seen something, someone was fighting, someone was dying. Then came the war cries. To settlers who had never heard them before, they sounded inhuman, wild, fierce, filled with rage and ancient power. The cries rose from every side, surrounding the cabins, closing off escape. Men inside the walls were torn between terror and duty. They knew what those cries meant. They knew what was coming, and yet they could not run. Their families needed them. Their homes needed them. On the frontier, a man who fled would be remembered only as a coward. A man who stayed would be remembered at least as a protector. Within moments, dogs began barking, deep, frantic, uncontrollable. Chickens screamed and scattered in their coops. Horses reared, snapping their tethers, hooves smashing against wood. And then the settlers saw it. Fire, bright, hungry flames rising behind barns and stables. Fire was not simply a weapon, it was a message. It meant the attackers were not just here to frighten, they were here to destroy. Cabins lit up with sudden orange glow as flames spread through dry grass and timber walls. Smoke choked the air, thick and acrid. Sparks flew through open doors and cracks between logs. The settlers scrambled to stamp out embers, shouting orders to their children, handing buckets of water from one trembling hand to another. But there was never enough water. The fire always spread faster than anyone could carry. Outside, arrows rained through the smoke. Some struck the wooden walls with dull thuds, quivering before falling to the ground. Others found flesh. A man running to the barn to save his cattle might suddenly collapse, an arrow buried deep in his chest. A woman sprinting to pull her child inside might scream as a burning arrow struck the house above her, showering sparks onto her hair. Gunshots erupted next, settlers firing from windows, porches, and door cracks. Muskets boomed, smoke pouring from the barrels, but muskets took time to reload. In the time it took a settler to pour powder, ram the shot, and prime the pan, half a dozen arrows could already be flying toward his home. The attackers moved quickly and with purpose. They knew the land. They knew every hill, every tree, every shadow. They struck fast and vanished, appearing in a new place before a musket could be aimed. Their bodies blended into the darkness. Their movement was nothing but blurs between trees. They shouted to one another in voices that echoed off wood and stone, making it impossible for settlers to know where they would strike next. Inside the cabins, children cried. Mothers held them tight, whispering, "Stay low, stay quiet, don't look out the window." Fathers yelled orders, sweaty hands loading muskets faster than they ever had before. Every man remembered every warning he had ever heard from travelers. Stay inside unless you want to die. The moment a settler stepped outside into the open, he became a target, so they shot from doorways. They shot from windows. They shot through holes drilled in the walls for this very moment. But fear was a powerful enemy. Smoke burned their eyes. The smell of burning wood filled their lungs. The heat of nearby flames turned the inside of the cabin into an oven. Children coughed and sobbed. Women held wet cloths over their mouths. Every corner of the room flickered with orange and red light, and then came the sound that no settler ever forgot, the thud of something slamming against the door. Sometimes it was the body of a desperate neighbor, begging to be let inside before attackers reached him. Sometimes it was the attackers themselves, striking the wood with hatchets, rifles, or torches, trying to tear it down. The settlers pushed furniture against the entrance, stables, chests, anything heavy enough to block the way. The door shook beneath every blow. Dust fell from the ceiling. Children screamed, and still the families held the line, praying the wood would hold. If the attackers set the house on fire, the family had one choice: run and die outside, or burn and die inside. Some did run. Those who fled ran blindly into the forest. Barefoot, clothed only in nightgowns or shirts, they sprinted through branches and thorns, tripping over roots, crashing into trees. The darkness swallowed them whole. Behind them, cabins burned like lanterns in the night. Screams echoed through the woods. Some escaped, many did not, others hid. They hid in basements, in cellars, beneath floorboards. They hid in root holes and animal pens. They hid beneath the bodies of those already dead. Silence became their shield. Stillness became their salvation. Those who survived learned quickly that breathing too loudly could mean death. Sometimes the attackers did not storm the cabin at all. Sometimes they waited. They circled the home like wolves, patient and silent. They shot flaming arrows onto the roof, letting the fire do the work. They watched the smoke curl upward, watched the settlers inside cough and choke, watched them choose between fire and the blade. Hours passed like this: screams, gunshots, crackling flames, pounding footsteps, battle cries. The night stretched endlessly, every moment heavier than the last. But eventually, even the fiercest raiders grew tired. Some left after setting enough destruction to make their message clear. Others fought until the settlers either fled or fell, and then came the longest part of all, the waiting. Long after the last shout faded, long after the final arrow struck wood, the settlers remained silent inside their cabins. They dared not move. They dared not speak. A man could sit for an hour with his musket raised, staring at the door, terrified that opening it would mean death. A woman might rock her child in her arms, trembling, afraid to stand upright. Some families sat in darkness until sunrise, not knowing whether the world outside was safe or filled with enemies still lurking in shadows. The silence returned, but this silence was not the same as the silence before the attack. This silence was heavier. It carried loss. It carried smoke. It carried the weight of death. And when the first settlers finally opened their doors, they stepped into a world changed forever. Cabins smoldered. Ash drifted through the air like gray snow. Barns were gone. Fields burned black. Smoke rose into the morning sky. The dead lay in the grass, some settlers, some attackers, tools scattered. Wagons overturned, horses gone, and those who survived walked not like farmers or pioneers, but like ghosts. From that day forward, every small sound in the night made them flinch. Every time the wind grew still, their hearts raced. Every time the birds went quiet, a chill ran through their bones, because they knew something that those back in the cities could never understand. On the frontier, death did not always knock on the door. Sometimes it only whispered, and when the land grew silent, that whisper became a scream. Chaos did not arrive slowly on the frontier. It did not tap gently or announce its approach with warning. It came fast, violent, and merciless, like a storm tearing the world apart. When the first flames touched the frontier cabins and the first war cries cut through the night, every breath became a battle for survival. Inside those small, rough-hewn wooden walls, settlers transformed from ordinary families into desperate defenders, fighting against fear as much as against their attackers. Imagine the inside of a frontier cabin when the attack begins. A single lantern swings from a wooden beam, its flame flickering wildly, throwing long, trembling shadows across the room. The walls shake with every impact from outside. Arrows strike the logs with sharp, hateful snaps. Sparks fall through the gaps. Smoke leaks in from somewhere, at first a trickle, then a flood. Someone screams, someone prays. Children cling to their mothers, fingers digging into clothing, faces wet with tears they don't understand. And every heart inside that cabin pounds with the same terrible question, will we die tonight? The men had no time to think. Instinct was their commander now. Their hands moved with a speed born not from training, but from terror. Muskets that were polished at daybreak became blackened with powder by midnight. Every shot fired meant a moment of deafening thunder, the recoil biting into their shoulders, smoke burning their eyes. Then came the frantic struggle to reload. Powder horn, wad, lead ball, ram, prime the pan, aim again, hands shaking, sweat dripping, breath shallow. Every second spent reloading was a second the attackers gained ground. Outside, bodies moved in the dark, shadows darting between trees, disappearing behind rocks, reappearing near the barn, then at the animal pens, then suddenly at the front door. Torches waved like fiery serpents, their flames dancing against the night sky. The attackers shouted to one another, voices echoing in strange rhythms through the valley. It was impossible to tell how many were out there. 10, 20, 100. The sound made it feel as if the entire forest was alive and closing in. Inside the cabin, the floorboards trembled with footsteps. The smallest children hid under beds or crawling into corners where the lantern light couldn't reach them. Mothers tried to comfort them, whispering words they barely believed themselves. Every whisper was a lie they hoped would become truth. It will be over soon. Be brave. God is with us. But the screams outside made those words feel fragile, like thin glass ready to shatter. The heat grew fiercer as the fire spread beyond the barns and touched the cabins themselves. Dry wood was a perfect fuel. Flames climbed the walls, raced across roofs, and burst through windows. Smoke filled the air inside, the kind of thick, choking smoke that clung to lungs and stole breath. Eyes watered and burned, the lantern light blurred. The room glowed orange, as if the walls themselves were turning into flame. Some settlers tried to fight the fire, while others kept loading muskets. Buckets of water were thrown on smoldering wood, but the water steamed and hissed, swallowed instantly by the heat. Mothers dampened blankets and shoved them under doors and windows to block sparks. Children coughed until their voices cracked. Every lungful of smoke tasted like swallowing ash. One of the cruelest truths of the frontier was that the attackers did not have to break down the door to kill everyone inside. Fire could do their work for them. A family trapped in a burning cabin had only two choices: stay and choke or run and be cut down in the open. That decision, the decision between fire and blade, was a nightmare that thousands of settlers faced. Some chose to run, some stayed until the walls collapsed. There was no safe choice, only the hope of a miracle. When settlers did run, panic controlled their feet. The moment the door burst open, night swallowed them. Bare earth turned to roots and stones. The forest floor was a maze of hidden dangers. Branches tore skin, thorns ripped clothing. Children were dragged along by their mothers, stumbling, sobbing, trying to keep up. Men tried to shield their families with their bodies, stepping in front of arrows, pushing ahead through trees with the strength of pure fear. The attackers knew every inch of the land. They moved silently, cutting off paths, circling fleeing families, steering them toward traps or cliffs or rivers too deep to cross in darkness. The settlers could not see their pursuers, but they heard them. Twigs snapping, feet pounding the earth, war cries rising behind them, growing louder, closer. The forest became a hunting ground, and the settlers were prey. Even for those who stayed inside the cabins, safety was an illusion. The sound of splitting wood meant attackers were trying to breach the door. The crack of hatchets echoed through the room, each strike sending splinters flying from the frame. The furniture pushed against the door trembled and shifted. Men leaned against it, pressing their bodies forward, muscles straining, trying to hold it closed. Women grabbed whatever weapons they could, knives, axes, hammers, ready to fight if the attackers pushed their way in. The cabin was no longer a home. It was a fortress under siege, a cage of wood and fear. Sometimes, in the middle of this chaos, a sudden silence fell. The blows against the door stopped. The footsteps outside went quiet. The screams faded. The attackers vanished as quickly as they had appeared. For a moment, settlers dared to believe it was over, but silence was a trick. Silence was a trap. Just when hope flickered, the next wave came. Arrows through the windows, torches thrown onto the roof, screams from behind the house. The attackers struck from every direction, never twice from the same approach. They fought like shadows, and shadows cannot be predicted. Inside, every sound carried danger: a baby's cry, a cough, a whisper. Settlers learned to silence themselves, covering mouths, holding their breath, praying the darkness would not hear them. Even the smallest noise could draw attention. Some survivors later wrote about what they heard during these long nights: moans from the wounded outside, horses screaming, the crackling of fire devouring wood, the sickening thud of rifle butts smashing against doors, the eerie whistle of arrows slicing through air, the shattering of glass, and worst of all, the sounds of neighbors, their cries, their pleas, their last breath. For the settlers, the hardest thing of all was knowing they could not help anyone. A neighbor might be dying just a few feet from the cabin door, begging for rescue, but opening the door meant death for everyone inside. The heart wanted to save them. Survival demanded silence. That choice left scars that never healed. Hours dragged on like days. The night felt endless. Every minute without attack felt like borrowed time. The settlers jumped at every shadow, every flicker of light looked like a torch, every gust of wind sounded like footsteps. Some families prayed quietly, others sobbed, some men stared at the door with empty eyes, too exhausted to feel anything anymore. And still they loaded their muskets, still they stood guard, still they fought. When dawn finally arrived, it came slowly, pale light creeping across the sky, pushing back the darkness inch by inch. The attackers rarely stayed after sunrise. They drifted away into the forest, leaving destruction behind them. But the settlers did not trust the light. They waited. Minutes passed, then hours. Only when the sun rose fully did they dare to open the door. And the world outside was unrecognizable. Cabins reduced to blackened skeletons, roofs collapsed, barns gone, chickens scattered or dead, cattle missing, wagons overturned and burned, smoke drifting in gray columns into a silent sky. The smell of death thick in the air. The battlefield was not a distant field or a distant country. It was their yard, their home, their life. Some families emerged together, alive but broken. Others came out missing members, fathers, mothers, sisters, brothers. Some cabins never opened at all. The fire had taken everything, and for those who survived, there was no time to mourn. There were wounded to care for, bodies to bury, ashes to sift through for anything that could be saved. The survivors saw things that no parent, no child, no human should ever see, and they knew with heavy certainty that the attackers would return, maybe in a week, maybe in a month, maybe the next night. The frontier gave no promises, only challenges, only warnings. Chaos on the frontier was not just a moment, it was a memory that lived forever, a scar burned into the mind, a lesson written in blood and fire. Families learned to sleep lightly, to keep weapons close, to trust the silence less and fear it more. Children grew up believing danger lived just beyond the trees, invisible but always listening. And every night, settlers closed their doors with the same thought. If we survive tonight, we are blessed. If we survive tomorrow, we are lucky. If we survive the frontier, we are something more than human. Because on this edge of the world, chaos was not an event. It was a way of life. The battle for survival did not feel heroic. It felt desperate. It felt filthy. It felt like the world had shrunk into a single burning cabin, and every heartbeat was a war drum inside the chest. Smoke filled the lungs, fear tightened the muscles, and the mind clung to a single thought: stay alive. On the frontier, there were no soldiers in neat rows, no polished commanders shouting orders, no formations or flags. There were farmers with trembling hands, mothers clutching kitchen knives, children carrying gunpowder and bullets because there was no one else to do it. The moment attackers came, ordinary life vanished. Every man, woman, and child transformed, not because they wished to, but because they had to. Survival was the only law. Inside cabins that had been peaceful only hours before, everything became a weapon. A musket that had once hunted deer was now pointed at shadows flickering between burning fence posts. Axes used to cut logs now waited behind doors, ready to fall on whoever forced their way inside. Even kitchen tools, iron pokers from the hearth, butcher knives, and wooden mallets, became instruments of defense. There was no elegance, no tactics, no time to plan. The attack came fast, and reaction came faster. A man who hesitated was a man already lost. Outside, the attackers moved like ghosts. Their footsteps were quick and silent, their shapes blurry through the smoke. They shouted to confuse, fired to terrify, and used the darkness as their greatest ally. A cabin wall that stood strong in daylight suddenly seemed paper thin when musket balls cracked through its boards. Every impact made families flinch. Every new hole let firelight creep inside, like the night itself was clawing its way forward. Inside one cabin, a father stood with his musket braced against the window frame. He could barely see his targets, only streaks of movement in the orange glow of burning hay. His wife knelt beside him, loading bullets as fast as shaking hands allowed. For years, her hands had kneaded bread, washed clothes, and held babies. Now they packed powder, rammed wads, and closed the breech of a weapon meant to keep her family alive. Their oldest son, only 12, kept gunpowder horns near the hearth. The daughter held her youngest sibling close beneath a heavy table, shielding the child's eyes from the violence only inches away. Their family was not unique. Hundreds of frontier homes faced the same terror, the same choice, fight or fall. When the father pulled the trigger, the musket's roar filled the cabin and echoed through the valley. The recoil kicked into his shoulder, smoke burst from the muzzle and replaced the air with the sharp smell of powder. Outside, someone fell. It bought only seconds of safety. The attackers did not retreat. They circled. They fired again. A musket ball punched through the wall and struck the table leg near the children. Splinters exploded into the girl's hair, but she held the baby tighter and did not scream. On the frontier, even children learned silence could mean survival. In another homestead a short distance away, the fight was even closer. A cabin of rough logs had been set ablaze, the flames racing up the dried oak walls like they were drinking the night. The family inside could not stay. Smoke poured down like a curtain, and the heat was unbearable. The father kicked out the back door and told everyone to run for the woods. They had no time to take supplies, no time to think of anything except escape. But attackers waited there too, and the family was forced to retreat back into the house, choking on smoke, eyes burning, desperate for a way out. The father smashed open floorboards and found an opening to the cellar. He lowered his family into the darkness while sparks rained from the collapsing roof. He stayed up above with his rifle, taking a position behind a beam that had not yet caught fire. Every time he fired, he prayed his family below would remain undiscovered. Every time flames crackled, he feared the ceiling would come down. In the root cellar beneath the burning floor, the family huddled. The mother tried to quiet the children, pressing a hand over their trembling mouths while tears streaked her soot-covered cheeks. They could hear the footsteps of the attackers inside the house. Slow, careful, searching, the boards above their heads creaked, ash sifted down through cracks. They held their breath as long as human lungs would allow. If one child whimpered, if one cough escaped, the end would come swiftly. They could do nothing but wait, pressed against one another, surrounded by smoke and fear. And yet, the settlers did not surrender easily. If they ran out of bullets, they swung rifles like clubs. If their rifles broke, they grabbed axes. If they had no steel left, they fought with fists, with teeth, with every ounce of strength a terrified human body could produce. These were not warriors taught in barracks. They were fathers who refused to watch their wives die, wives who refused to watch their children taken, children who refused to lose the little world they knew. Some cabins had been built close together, neighbors separated by only a few hundred yards. When one family's home was attacked, others could sometimes hear the cries and gunfire. A neighbor might try to help, sprinting through the dark with their own musket ready, knowing full well they might arrive only in time to see flames and shadows. Some made it in time, some did not. The frontier rewarded courage and punished hesitation, but even courage could not guarantee survival. In many attacks, settlers were outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and caught completely off guard. They had no fort walls, no stone towers, no guards in rotation. They had fragile wooden homes surrounded by hundreds of miles of wilderness. Still, there were victories. When settlers fought back fiercely enough, sometimes attackers lost men, lost momentum, and withdrew into the trees. After every musket blast from a cabin, the attackers had to pause and decide whether pressing forward was worth the risk. They tested doors, tried windows, and listened for weakness. In some homes, settlers had reinforced their doors with iron nails and heavy beams. It helped, but not always. Attackers used tomahawks, clubs, and fire to force their way in. Once the door gave way, the fight became hand to hand. The sound of wood splintering into the night was one of the most terrifying sounds a settler could hear, the warning that the enemy was already inside. As the fighting raged, the sky glowed with flames from burning barns, fences, and wagons. Horses screamed as fire reached the stables. Livestock ran wild, trampling anything in their path. The land that settlers had tamed with years of sweat and labor was suddenly returning to chaos. Fences became ash, fields turned into black scars, and every familiar landmark disappeared in the smoke. The frontier was unforgiving enough without violence, but in these moments, nature and war worked together to crush hope. Inside some cabins, settlers formed a barricade behind tables, chairs, chests, and barrels. Anything that could slow down an attacker was dragged into place. Children crouched behind these makeshift walls, while adults fought in front of them. Words were few. One had time for speeches. Communication was short, sharp, and frantic. Reload, stay down, keep quiet. Every movement mattered, every breath mattered. The settlers did not care about bravery. They cared only about staying alive until the attackers disappeared. A wounded settler tried to keep fighting even as blood soaked into the dirt floor. Pain did not matter. Exhaustion did not matter. Every time he thought his strength was ending, he looked at his family and found more. This was how ordinary people became legends, not because they sought glory, but because they refused to let death come easily. In the morning, they might collapse from pain, but during the attack, adrenaline and determination pushed their bodies to limits they never believed possible. Women who had never fired a weapon before that night learned quickly. Hands that once held cradles, wove cloth, and prepared meals now packed powder and pulled triggers. Their arms shook from the recoil, but they fired again. They whispered prayers not for victory, but for a miracle. Every shot they fired meant one more second of life for someone inside the cabin. Children learned the taste of fear far too young. They cried silently into their mother's skirts, their tiny hearts pounding so hard they thought the sound alone would give them away. But even in terror, they did what they could. A little boy might run cartridges from the hearth to the window where his father stood. A young girl might bring water to her wounded brother. On the frontier, childhood ended early. The world demanded it. Outside, the night was a blur of shadows, sparks, silhouettes, and screams. Every tree became a hiding place for attackers. Every bush concealed a threat. The smoke stung eyes, obscured vision, and turned the world into a nightmare where shapes moved without warning. The settlers did not know how many attackers there were, where they came from, or when they would leave. They only saw flashes of movement, heard the whistle of arrows, and felt the impact of bullets against the logs of their homes. If the cabin held, the settlers had a chance. If the walls caught fire or collapsed, the family inside would be exposed. Some cabins were soaked from recent rain and resisted the flames. Others were dry and burned quickly, forcing the families to choose between smoke and swords. A burning cabin was a death trap. The heat, the smoke, the falling beams, the collapsing roof. And yet, some settlers refused to leave, preferring to stand and fight until the bitter end. When the attackers set fire to roofs, the settlers climbed into lofts with buckets of water, trying desperately to put out the flames. Every drop mattered. Every minute the fire was delayed meant more time to survive. But water was limited, and smoke blinded them. They coughed, eyes tearing, lungs burning. The heat forced them back down the ladder. The flames spread faster than courage could stop them. Still, the settlers did not break. When one man fell, another took his place. When a musket misfired, they fixed it in seconds. When a door splintered, they slammed heavy furniture in front of it. When attackers climbed through windows, settlers met them with knives and hatchets. The walls shook, the floor cracked, voices shouted, weapons clashed, and the night roared with violence. This was not like the battles history remembers, with officers and banners and trumpets. This was raw, primal, human survival in its most brutal form. Every settler who fought that night carried centuries of instincts inside them, the instinct to protect, to defend, to survive. When everything else was stripped away, only that remained. Some settlers fought not only for themselves, but for neighbors. If the attackers moved from one cabin to the next, the settlers inside the second cabin might already know what was coming. They prepared themselves, barricading windows, loading extra muskets, hiding children in cellars or behind chests. The waiting was its own torture. They listened to distant screams, distant gunfire, distant crashes, and prayed the attackers would stop before reaching their door. But the footsteps always came. The darkness always delivered terror. Those who fought in the open air had even less protection. A farmer caught outside his house might have no time to reach the door. He turned to defend himself with whatever he carried, an axe still sticky with sap from chopping wood, a pitchfork, a hunting knife. He fought in the yard, among burning wagons and scattered barrels, knowing that every second he delayed, the attackers gave his family more time to escape or hide. Some died in their front yards, their bodies lit by the flames of their own homes. There were moments of desperate bravery, acts no one would ever hear about because there was no one left to tell the story. A mother who stood in the doorway with a musket, refusing to move until her children reached the cellar. A teenage boy who stayed in the loft to keep pouring water on the roof, because if the flames spread, there would be no escape. A wounded settler who could no longer reload his rifle, but still swung it like a club. A father who held the door closed with his own body while his family crawled through a window into the darkness. Some settlers survived by trickery. They pretended to be dead, lying still on the floor while attackers searched the house. They slowed their breathing, let blood drip around them, stared at the dirt without blinking. If they moved even slightly, they would die. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it did not. There was no guarantee, only chance. Through all of this, something extraordinary happened, something history often forgets. Settlers who fought side by side developed unbreakable bonds. A neighbor who defended your family became family. A child who carried ammunition became a hero. A woman who reloaded muskets under fire became a warrior. The frontier erased the boundaries between men and women, young and old. Survival belonged to the brave, to the quick, to the determined. Even when the attackers seemed overwhelming, even when the cabins burned, even when the settlers' arms were tired and their lungs filled with smoke, they kept going. Some made one last charge out the back door, running into the woods, using the darkness to hide. Others stayed in their burning homes, hoping dawn would arrive before death. The frontier punished the weak, but it rewarded those who refused to surrender. As the night dragged on, the settlers reached a level of exhaustion beyond anything they had ever known. Their muscles ached, their ears rang from constant gunfire, and every breath felt like breathing fire. Yet they did not stop. Every shot, every strike, every scream was a promise to themselves and to God that they would not die quietly. If the attackers wanted their land, they would have to fight for every inch. In some places, the settlers pushed the attackers back just far enough to gain a moment of silence, a moment to reload, a moment to breathe, a moment to look at the people beside them and know they were still alive. Those moments were precious. They felt like small victories in a night filled with terror. The battle was not clean. It was not glorious. It was not what poets would later sing about. It was mud, blood, ash, broken wood, shattered weapons, screams in the dark, hands shaking so badly that bullets spilled onto the floor. It was raw, human, and desperate. And yet, inside that chaos, There was something powerful, something history should always remember. The settlers did not fight for conquest. They did not fight for gold or fame or land stolen from someone else. They fought for their families. They fought for their children sleeping under blankets in dark corners. They fought for the right to wake up alive the next morning, and that kind of fight, the kind driven by love and fear combined, turns ordinary people into the fiercest defenders in the world. By the time the night neared its end, many settlers had no strength left. Their arms could barely lift weapons. Their voices were hoarse from smoke and shouting. Their clothes were burned, torn, and soaked with blood. But they held the line. They stood in doorways, behind windows, on porches, in fields, exhausted, shaking, but unbroken. If the attackers wanted victory, they would have to step over bodies and walk into gunfire again and again. And many chose not to. The attackers withdrew slowly, disappearing into the trees just as silently as they had arrived. Their shapes blended with the forest until the settlers could no longer see them. Only then did the settlers lower their weapons. Only then did they dare to breathe. Only then did they realize they had survived, if only barely. And when the sun finally rose, its light fell on a world of ashes, broken fences, scattered belongings, and silent cabins. Some settlers walked out of their damaged homes with trembling legs. Others crawled out of cellars, coughing, crying, clutching one another. They emerged into a morning that felt like another lifetime compared to the night before. The land around them was scarred, their homes were wounded or destroyed, but they were alive, and that meant everything, because on the frontier, survival itself was victory. The night did not end quickly. It stretched on, heavy and suffocating, as if time itself refused to move forward. The settlers trapped inside their cabins, or hiding beneath floorboards, or curled up in barns and root cellars, felt every passing second like a knife pressed against their skin. For them, darkness was not just the absence of light. It was the presence of danger. It was the unknown. It was the breath on the back of the neck that they could not see. And until the sun rose, until the first bird dared to sing again, they lived in a world where nothing was certain, not even the next heartbeat. Outside, the attackers did not leave all at once. They prowled through the settlement like wolves, searching for anything left behind: livestock, tools, weapons, prisoners, anything that could be taken. They stripped saddle, leather, tore cloth, looted supplies, and sometimes simply destroyed whatever they could not carry. Their footsteps echoed through the dark, crunching over broken wood and scattering the embers of burning fences. Every snapped twig, every shifting shadow, made the settlers inside their cabins tighten their grip on weapons that felt heavier with every minute. Inside one cabin, a family crouched behind a toppled chest that served as a barricade. The mother held a pistol in her lap, though she had already fired every bullet she had. The father leaned against the wall, pressing cloth against a wound in his arm. The children sat between them, silent, shivering, too frightened to speak. Hours passed with no sound except the popping of burning timber and the distant howl of wolves who smelled fear and blood in the air. The father wondered whether the attackers would come back, kick in the door, and finish what they started. The mother wondered whether dawn would come before their courage ran out. The children wondered whether God had listened to their whispered prayers. Not far away, another family was locked in a cellar beneath their house. The air below was thick with smoke that had seeped through the floor. The children cried softly into their mother's shoulder, afraid to speak, afraid to breathe too loudly. The father held his musket across his knees, though the darkness was so complete he could barely see his own hands. Above them, footsteps walked across the floor, slow, heavy, deliberate. Someone dragged something across the boards. Someone overturned furniture. The attackers were still searching. The father's heart beat so loudly he feared the sound alone would betray them. Sweat rolled down his face and neck. The cellar walls felt as though they were closing in. Every passing moment stretched further than the last. He pressed a finger to his lips, reminding his wife and children to stay silent. None of them moved, none of them breathed. If the floorboards gave way or a child whimpered, the night would end in blood. The chaos of the attack had faded into something worse: silence, the kind of silence that traps people inside their own thoughts. Outside the cabins, the world looked calm from a distance, but up close, it was filled with death, fire, and fear. The smell of smoke mixed with the smell of burning flesh and gunpowder. The ground was scattered with broken arrows, empty powder horns, torn clothing, and bodies, human and animal alike. Horses that had broken free ran wild through the fields, neighing in panic, their silhouettes leaping in and out of the firelight like ghosts. In the shadows at the edge of the forest, small groups of settlers who had escaped earlier crouched behind fallen logs and boulders. Some carried children in their arms, others dragged wounded family members who could barely walk. They had no blankets, no weapons, no food, only the clothes on their backs and the terror still pounding through their veins. They whispered to one another, asking who survived, who was missing, and whether their homes still stood. No one had answers. They could only listen to the sounds of the night and pray to hear the distant bugle of cavalry that would never come. For some settlers, the woods became their only refuge. They stumbled blindly through branches and brambles, guided only by instinct and fear. The trees seemed endless, stretching in every direction. They tripped over roots, tore their clothes on thorns, scraped their knees on rocks hidden beneath leaves. Every rustle of leaves made them flinch. Every snap of a twig sent panic through their bodies. They had escaped the flames, but not the fear. Some found hiding places beneath fallen logs or inside hollow trees. Some crouched in cold streams to cool their burned skin. Some simply collapsed from exhaustion and prayed the attackers would not follow. But the night was not endless, though it felt eternal to those living inside it. The sky slowly began to shift. The stars faded, one by one, hidden by the growing haze of smoke. The horizon lightened, not quickly, not mercifully, but inch by inch. Before the sun rose, the world turned a deep charcoal gray. The darkness thinned just enough for shapes to become visible. Trees regained their outlines. Burned cabins became ghostly silhouettes against the sky. The first faint breeze of morning carried away some of the smoke, revealing the scars left behind. When the attackers finally withdrew, they made no proclamation, no signal, no dramatic retreat. They simply vanished into the wilderness, slipping between trees, fading from sight, leaving the ruined settlement behind. Their departure was almost as silent as their arrival. Settlers inside their cabins did not know they were gone. Not yet. They stayed hidden, too afraid to move, too afraid to believe the night was ending. Their hearts still pounded, their bodies still shook, and their minds refused to trust what their eyes told them. It was not sunrise that made survivors emerge. It was sound. The first brave rooster, confused or fearless, crowed into the smoky dawn. A dog barked somewhere distant. A surviving horse snorted and shook ashes from its mane. The world began to live again, but softly, as if unsure whether it was allowed to. One by one, settlers opened their doors, slowly, carefully, weapons in hand. The first breath of morning felt cold. The air tasted like ash and fear. They stepped outside and saw what the night had taken. Cabins that had stood for years were burned to skeletons. Barns were reduced to smoking piles of ember. Wagons had collapsed into charred wheels and twisted iron. Fences that once marked boundaries were now nothing but black lines on the ground. The land that yesterday had looked like opportunity now looked like death. The silence of dawn was worse than the screams of night. It forced survivors to confront the truth. Bodies lay in the dirt, friends, neighbors, family. Some were burned beyond recognition. Some still clutched weapons they tried to use. Some seemed to be frozen in mid-run, as if death had caught them in motion. The settlers who had lived through the night stared at the dead in shock. Their minds struggled to understand what had happened. Their hearts struggled to accept who was gone. For some families, every member survived. For others, only one remained. A wife stepped outside her ruined cabin and looked around with hollow eyes, searching for her husband. Her children clung to her dress, crying softly. She walked across the yard, calling his name, but only the morning wind answered. When she reached the fence line, she saw him lying face down in the grass. She fell beside him, her cries echoing through the valley. No one told her to be strong. No one told her to stand. Out here, grief was a language everyone understood. A young boy, no older than 11, walked barefoot across the ashes of what had been his home. He carried a burnt doll that belonged to his sister. He did not cry. He stared ahead, silent, numb, as if something inside him had burned away too. His sister had been taken in the night. His parents were gone. He did not know whether to search for them, bury them, or follow them into the next world. He just walked, because stopping felt impossible. Survivors began gathering in small groups near the largest remaining cabins. They counted who lived, they counted who died. Their voices were hushed, cracked, raw. Every name spoken was a wound. Some cried openly, others stared blankly at the ground. A few sat alone, unable to move. They were still alive, but something inside them felt broken. As the sun climbed higher, patches of light fell on the ruined settlement. Smoke curled upward in thin trails. Birds circled overhead, unsure whether the land was safe. The settlers moved with slow, stiff steps, helping the wounded, searching for missing children, putting out fires before they spread to what little remained. Some tried to salvage belongings from the rubble. A pot, a blanket, a handful of tools, tiny fragments of a life that had been shattered. They dug through ashes with bare hands, ignoring the heat, ignoring the cuts on their fingers. If they found something unburned, they held it like treasure. A memory saved, and yet, amid all the destruction, there were miracles. A toddler found asleep beneath a table that had collapsed on top of him, protecting him from falling debris. A dog that returned from the woods, limping, bleeding, but alive. A family that emerged from a root cellar after hours of silence, eyes red from smoke, but all together. Every survivor was a miracle. Every breath was a blessing. As the day continued, the settlers faced decisions that felt heavier than any burden they had ever carried. Some wanted to leave, to abandon the frontier forever, to flee back east where towns had walls and soldiers patrolled the streets. They believed no land was worth this pain, this fear, this loss. Their hearts had been cut too deeply. The graves they would dig today would mark the end of their courage. But others refused to run. They stood in the ashes and swore quietly, fiercely, that they would rebuild. Their homes could burn. Their barns could fall. Their livestock could scatter, but their spirit, no fire could touch that. They believed leaving would mean defeat, and the frontier taught them never to bow their heads. They would bury their dead with honor, rebuild their cabins stronger, and leave again on the land that had tried to break them. Some settlers came together to dig graves. The ground was hard from cold nights, and the work was slow. They dug with shovels, with broken boards, with their bare hands. Every mound of earth was a wound. Every grave was a story cut short. Some had markers carved from wood. Others had no names left to write. The settlers gathered around each grave in silence. They prayed in broken voices. They wept with open grief. On the frontier, funerals were not formal. They were raw. They were honest. They were necessary. The wounded needed tending. Settlers tore strips of cloth from whatever fabric remained, shirts, dresses, blankets, and used them as bandages. They boiled water to clean wounds. They applied salves made from herbs and roots. There were no doctors, no hospitals, no medicines except those they carried in memory. Some would survive. Some would die slowly over the next few days. Their families sat beside them, holding their hands, speaking softly, promising them that they were not alone. Food became a concern. The attackers had taken livestock, burned barns, and destroyed stores of grain. The settlers who remained had little left to eat. They shared what they could. Some hunted, though the woods felt dangerous and every crack of a twig made their hearts jump. Others trapped rabbits or fished in nearby streams. Children gathered berries, roots, anything edible. Hunger did not care about grief. It came anyway. Even as the sun warmed the valley, shadows lingered in the hearts of the survivors. The night had taken something more than lives and homes. It had taken innocence. The settlers looked at their land differently now. Every tree was a potential hiding place. Every rustle in the grass was a threat. Every nightfall brought fear back into their eyes. Some slept with weapons beside their beds for years after. Some never slept peacefully again. Yet, strangely, the attack also forged something powerful. It bound survivors together in ways nothing else could. They shared suffering. They shared loss. They shared stories of bravery, of sacrifice, of loved ones who died protecting others. Bonds formed that were stronger than blood. A neighbor was no longer just a neighbor. He was a brother. A woman whose house was spared took in children whose parents had died. A man who lost his wife helped rebuild the cabin of a family who lost everything. They became a community not just by proximity, but by pain. In the evenings following the attack, the survivors sat around small fires. They spoke rarely. Words felt too heavy, but they stayed together because loneliness was unbearable. The flames flickered on exhausted faces, casting shadows that made them look older than they were. Some stared into the fire as if waiting for answers that would never come. Others whispered prayers. A few played soft music on battered fiddles or harmonicas, letting the notes float gently into the night. The music sounded fragile, wounded, but it was music none the less, and that meant hope was still alive. When night came again, fear returned. Parents tucked their children close, whispering that they were safe, even if they themselves did not believe it. Torches and lanterns burned through the long hours. Dogs patrolled the yards, barking at every sound. The settlers slept lightly, weapons nearby, hearts uneasy. Some dreamed of flames. Others dreamed of footsteps outside their doors. Some barely slept at all, sitting awake with eyes fixed on the horizon, watching for movement in the dark. But the second night was different from the first. The attackers did not return. The settlers survived the darkness again, and when dawn broke, the sunlight felt a little warmer, a little more real. The world had not ended. Days passed, smoke faded, birds returned, grass began to grow again over the blackened ground, and one morning a child ran through a field, laughing, not because he forgot the night, but because even children who have seen horror can still find joy. The settlers heard the sound and felt their hearts lift, even if only for a moment. Survival did not erase the pain. It did not bring back the dead. It did not rebuild homes or heal wounds quickly, but survival meant something. It meant the frontier had tested them and found them unbreakable. It meant that fear was not stronger than courage. It meant that life, even shattered, was still worth living. The long night was over. The longest night many settlers would ever endure, a night of terror, of fire, of desperation, but they survived, and survival was victory. When the sun finally rose over the burned horizon, it did not rise slowly. It seemed to burst through the darkness, as if light itself was impatient to reclaim what the night had tried to steal. Its first rays slipped between blackened tree trunks, and over the smoldering ruins of what had once been a settlement filled with laughter, chores, life, and hope. Now the morning was silent, not peaceful but hollow, empty in a way only survivors truly understand. Smoke curled from collapsed roofs, ash drifted in the air like falling snow. The wind carried the faint smell of fire, gunpowder, and something far heavier, loss. Yet from the wreckage, from cellars and hiding places, from the thick woods where families had fled, survivors emerged. Their bodies were stiff, their faces gray with exhaustion and soot. Their hands trembled as they touched the earth, the beams, the ashes of their own homes, checking, wondering if this was real, or if it was just another moment of terror that the night had not yet ended. This was the moment that defined the frontier more than any battle, more than any story of conquest or expansion. If darkness was the test, then sunrise was the judgment. Some people could not stand. Some cried, some stared forward with empty eyes, unable to process that they were alive while others were gone. Mothers called out the names of children. Fathers searched through scorched rubble for tools, supplies, food, anything that could help them survive another day. There were no doctors, no townsfolk, no chaplains to comfort them. There were only neighbors, family, strangers bound together by the single fact that they had endured the same night. Death had walked among them, and somehow they had walked out of its shadow. Survival on the frontier was not a single moment. It was not just hiding in a cellar or fighting in the dark. Survival was what came after, the crushing weight of reality when the danger passed and the cost became clear. For some, a home could be rebuilt. For others, graves had to be dug in the frozen ground. And for the rest, there was no time to mourn. The wilderness had attacked, but the wilderness did not forgive weakness. If you stopped, you starved. If you cried too long, you froze. Life demanded motion, even when the soul wished only to collapse. Those who survived the most terrifying attacks on the frontier didn't simply stand among ruins. They faced the unbearable task of deciding what came next. Some gathered whatever remained and left, unwilling to risk another night. Others refused to surrender the land they had worked themselves to the bone for. They rebuilt walls, patched roofs, dug wells, and sharpened tools. The wounds they carried were not just physical. Every sound in the night would make a heart race. Every rustle of leaves might send someone reaching for a musket. Children woke screaming from nightmares they would never forget, because on the frontier, childhood was short and innocence shorter. And yet survivors forged on. It is easy to imagine the frontier as a place of courage and strength, but true courage was not loud. It did not shout or boast. It was quiet, worn into the bones of men and women who looked death in the face and kept going. The most terrifying attacks did not just destroy cabins. They tested the very limits of the human spirit. The people who lived through them had to wake up the next morning and work beside the graves of those they loved. They had to sleep in the same darkness that once nearly killed them. They had to walk the same paths where danger first appeared and pretend they were not afraid. Fear on the frontier never disappeared. It simply learned to live quietly in the mind. Many who survived did not speak about the horrors they witnessed. Their stories were whispered, not shouted. They were passed down to children not as tales of glory, but as warnings and lessons. Lock the doors, keep the weapons clean, trust the silence but never ignore it. Wood should always be dry and stacked. Horses should be fed even before the people, because when terror returned, speed could be the difference between life and death. Survival meant learning to live differently, seeing the world with new eyes. The forest was not just trees, it was 1,000 hiding places. A night sky was not just stars, it was a blanket where danger could slide unseen. Every shadow was a reminder. Every echo of wind carried memory. The survivors bore this knowledge like a weight, and yet they stayed. They built new barns over old ashes. They planted seeds beside burned fences. They held on to hope not because they were unafraid, but because they refused to surrender their humanity, and in that stubbornness history was written. Generations later, people would hear about brave settlers, pioneers, explorers, but those titles did not capture the truth. Frontier survivors were not adventurers seeking excitement. They were ordinary men and women who wanted land to farm, space to breathe, and a future for their children. But history rarely gifts progress without blood. Every town that now stands in peace once stood in fear. Every city was once a clearing hacked out of wilderness by hands blistered from work and trembling from terror. Some survivors moved to forts or settlements closer to other families. Others formed militias, building small defensive walls and lookout posts. The scars of the attack shaped everything that came after. No tool was left outside at night. No door remained unlocked. No fire burned without someone watching. A single moment of carelessness could bring disaster.